All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Ashley Morris. I'm currently Emergency Management Planner for Baltimore County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I've been doing emergency management for over 5 years on a local level, and I also went to Texas Tech University to study geophysics, geoscience, geography, and atmospheric science. I'm recording this presentation as one of my previous presentations that I gave at the 2022 Maryland Emergency Management Association Symposium. And the title is Weathering Emergency Management, Building a Weather Toolkit. So since I come out of the meteorology background field, and I also have been in emergency management, I've realized that there is a tremendous need to connect both the meteorological world with the emergency management world. And because we have a coalescing mission, or a mission that really intersects based on the processes of saving lives and protecting property, there are a ton of different resources from NOAA and the National Weather Service that we can really leverage and take advantage of, not only in an emergency operations center environment, but also for preparedness needs and also recovery needs. So tonight's presentation is going to first start with talking a little more about that intersection between weather and meteorology and emergency managers. So where exactly does our mission cross? And because that mission is starting to cross more and more, what really cool opportunities, tools, research, etc., is actually coming out to allow us to leverage these tools for us to do our job better. I'm also going to be talking about the weather needs of emergency management. So in terms of 3 different categories, typically in emergency management, we need weather data and observations. So the actual hard measurements of atmospheric conditions, whether or not it's the actual temperature, the wind chill, the heat index, the wind speed, the wind direction, etc. But also talking about weather data. So on top of observations, satellite imagery, radar, different things that show us what the atmosphere is doing. Number 2, going into community programming, which is extremely important when we're trying to build preparedness in our communities, but also trying to build resiliency and even assistance in disaster response with those who live in our communities. And then lastly, talking about incident operations support. So typically when we think of weather data, weather support, and things like that, we usually think about being in an emergency operations center, having some kind of weather-related disaster, needing weather briefings or weather impact reports from NWS for us to be able to make good decisions about evacuations or something of that nature. So I'm going to talk a little more about tools that we can use for that incident operations support in terms of the National Weather Service. So as I mentioned, I have kind of a unique background coming from not only the atmospheric science and the STEM field of meteorology, but also being in emergency management at a practitioner level for over 5 years, and really realizing that we really do have the same mission. So as emergency managers, as NWS meteorologists, our goal is to save lives and property. Believe it or not, those words are actually in the mission statement of the National Weather Service, and they're also in many of our mission statements. One of our key goals is to protect lives and property among anything else that we're trying to do. And so because we have that intersection, there are a ton of tools and opportunities that we can really leverage by building a solid partnership with the National Weather Service. With time, NWS and meteorologists have learned that it's not good enough anymore just to take a look at data and produce a forecast and put out watches and warnings. They do a tremendous job at doing that, and they are some of the best scientists in the world, but we have learned through different events such as Tuscaloosa, Joplin, and then a variety of other flood and heat incidents that having a perfect forecast and being able to get out warnings with ample notice does not always save lives and protect property. And because we've been working more on research about human decision-making, human communication, and social science, NWS has really transformed their mission to be a little less about that quantitative hard data, which is still important in terms of nailing a forecast and understanding the atmospheric physics and conditions, but actually steering more towards trying to provide information to first responders, public safety, and people who are making those kinds of decisions to save those lives. So as a part of that new strategic plan, NWS is providing consistent, actionable forecasts, warnings, and preparedness information to decision makers at all levels. They are providing specialized products, resources, and support for emergency managers at all levels. And they are also building opportunities to contribute to new National Weather Service products. So looking for opportunities to conduct surveys of emergency managers on certain products. Looking for opportunities to hold workshops where they can express how certain products and tools work and see if it's successful or useful for emergency management. And then also they're actually doing research test beds where a certain select amount of meteorologists can participate in research and actually be studied to see if their tools and their forecasts are actually causing emergency managers to make the right decision to save lives. So all of this really is just all about how our missions intersect, and we can really do great work when we are building those partnerships between the weather community and the emergency management community, and we're working together to both save lives and property. So tonight's talk is, like I said, all about going through toolkits, going through different tool pieces and resources for weather needs. And I can't really do that without first going into how NOAA and NWS offices are really laid out around the country. And so I think most emergency managers are fairly familiar with their local National Weather Service office that takes care of their local forecasts. And then two, because we have such a big emphasis on hurricane preparedness and response, most of us are pretty familiar with the National Hurricane Center, NHC, being the lead on tropical forecasting. However, there are some other specialized National Weather Service offices that I want to go into today because they provide valuable tools for hazards, and you might want to use them not only for good situational awareness, but also for decision making on EOC openings and things like that. So starting off with the Weather Prediction Center, or WPC. This office is actually one office that covers the entire nation, and they are providing United States medium range forecasts for high precipitation events involving rain and winter weather. They are very good at forecasting flood potential and also something that we like to call QPF, which is a fancy acronym for precipitation amount, usually in inches. So they put out nationwide maps for rain totals and also flood outlooks. And we're going to be going through that a little more later on in the presentation. The Storm Prediction Center, SPC. This is another one of those nationwide offices that provides United States outlooks for tornadoes, severe thunderstorms, and fire weather. So they are the lead experts in the country on all things convective weather, severe weather, and then even fire weather. And what's interesting about SPC is they actually work very closely with the local offices to put out severe thunderstorm watches and severe thunderstorm and tornado watches. So they help in tandem set up the watches for both tornado and severe weather. And usually with coordination of the local offices, we'll double check and confirm that the locals feel like it is a good product to put out. And usually, of course, they would agree because the SPC are some of the best forecasters in terms of severe weather. We have the National Hurricane Center, NHC, that I've already mentioned before. They kind of lead the country in tropical weather forecasting and products. They devote all of their time during hurricane season, looking at trends, looking at areas of interest, and producing tropical weather forecasts. When it's not Hurricane Center, they actually spend a lot of time doing hurricane research. So that office is and has some of the greatest hurricane researchers and forecasters in the world. And then lastly, the local NWS office, they obviously create short to medium range forecasts at a local level for weather hazards. They also issue your watches and warnings. And like I said, with permissions and discussions, they assist in issuing the tornado watches and the severe thunderstorm watches. So just touching on some of the weather needs that we have in emergency management. So obviously we already kind of went over the need for weather data, forecasts, and observations. More specifically, we need that for situational awareness and also for emergency planning needs during blue sky days. We also touched on community programming, so the need of having that community partnership and the need to actually leverage some of those weather safety and NOAA community building programs that are already out there being worked. And then lastly, instant decision supports, which is basically going to be your weather briefings and your weather data. So let's dive a little deeper into the need of emergency management for weather data, forecasts, and observations. So thinking about situational awareness, it's really important both before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm to be able to have current conditions or weather observations. Like we mentioned, weather observations are the current measurements of what the atmosphere is doing now. So it's not a projection, it's not a forecast, there's no error associated with it. It is what is being measured now. Current conditions are important if I'm doing any kind of field work and I'm concerned about heat index, training, if I'm trying to move resources and I have a certain wind threshold. So maybe I have high profile trucks or something for logistics and I have really high winds. That might delay my shipment for logistics or even cancel it completely if it's not safe to travel. Also for other additional needs that you might have out with field decision making. And then talking about projected precipitation, that's another need that we have for situational awareness. The reason that we need that is obviously it's really important to know how much precipitation we're going to get. There is a certain amount that we can get and handle effectively. There's also a certain amount that we all know are going to cause problems. So having that general outlook, forecast, or tool to tell us that helps us, once again, staff up, have briefings, prepare, pre-deploy, whatever we need to do to make sure we're ready for that rain or precipitation event. And then lastly is satellite. So satellite is a really great piece of situational awareness if you're doing any kind of operations that might be affected by cloud cover. So satellite typically shows you water vapor or just a cloud cover. So it's different than radar because it's showing you where the clouds are. And it also would depend on your ops, whether or not that would be beneficial. But that might be something, especially if you're doing any kind of aviation, if you're looking at cloud decks and cloud deck height, things like that. Planning. So I talked a little bit about the need for weather data for emergency planning needs. And specifically, when we think of that, we think of actually historic weather data and climate data that can actually be used for our THIRAs, our threat assessments, trying to figure out how many storm events, what kind of storm events, and what the impacts are. So I can do a THIRA and figure out my top hazards. Your THIRA really is your foundation for your preparedness programs, because typically you're going to take a look at your top threats, and then that is going to really steer your preparedness programs, your emergency plans, your disaster scenario exercises, any other additional training you might do, as well as mitigation and mitigation projects. It's important to note that threat assessment and even hazard assessment occurs in a hazard mitigation plan, and that is another valuable piece to be able to work with the National Weather Service or official meteorologists to grab that real data. So we're not just Googling what kind of storms did I have in my county or trying to guess what kind of storms we had. We're having real scientific data that's driving our prioritization in a very busy era of emergency management. Exercise scenarios. So using real weather data and understanding what kind of weather historic events we've had previously allow us to make sure that our exercises are realistic. We all know that that is extremely important because if we're going to be testing plans against unrealistic scenarios, number one, it's not helpful because we're not actually applying the plan to the right weather setup that it could potentially be used for. But it's also not helpful because a lot of our partners actually get put off by that. If they walk into a disaster exercise and you present them some freakish scenario that could never happen, a lot of them are just going to tune you out. They might sit there, they might haphazardly participate, but you're not going to get that full enthusiastic participation if you're not doing a realistic scenario. Already touched a little bit on the climatology and the historic storm reports. Both of those, I think, are just really pivotal for our emergency manager to understand what has happened previously, because if it has happened previously, it very well could happen again or worse. So very important to have that kind of data. Community programming. So like I mentioned before, it's so important to build weather readiness, but also weather reporting programs in our community, because when we're responding to weather, we're constantly trying to get people to not only be ready and be able to be resilient themselves, but also be able to share information with us so we can really steer our response in the right direction that it needs to be based on community impact. So there are a variety of different community programming that is currently offered by NOAA and NWS. Starting with weather safety is, of course, the Weather Ready Nation, which has been around for over a decade, promoting different methods, outreach, and different campaigns, trying to get residents and EOS community members more prepared for storms. We also have the season safety campaigns that NWS puts on. They've got a spring, summer, fall, and a winter. And they also do a hurricane season preparedness campaign. This is really great because a lot of their public information tools, such as graphics and videos, are free and shareable. So any public safety agency can go to that website, download all those, and use them, especially if you're starting to spin up to do a storm response, or maybe if you're just doing something for National Preparedness Month, or you just want to cover certain weather hazards to your community. Community reporting, like I mentioned, super essential that we're able to capture what's actually ongoing outside of the EOC in portions of our jurisdictions that we can't physically see. So some good programs are the Skywarn program, which I think everybody is pretty familiar with, having storm spotters who can identify funnels, call in tornadoes, call in damage, measure hail. Also, some offices have virtual operations support teams who are actually going on social media, trying to find storm reports and then forwarding those storm reports on to NWS and local emergency management. CocoRoss, which is actually a community reporting rain gauge and precipitation program, really trying to fill the holes in precipitation gathering. And then lastly, observation stations, which are a little more formal than the other programs because you have to be trained and you have to have an official observation station installed and installed correctly. But it is another really great way to fill the data gaps that we have, especially in the NWS service area. And then lastly, wrapping things up, weather readiness. So of course we have Storm Ready, which is a community program that allows you to do basically a preparedness checklist for your jurisdiction and allows you to achieve storm ready status. And then also there are the Weather Ready Nation Ambassador Program, where you can opt and pledge to be a Weather Ready Nation Ambassador, promoting severe weather safety not only to your employees and your community, but also trying to pass on outreach and participate in any community programming. All right, so going into incident decision support. Like I mentioned before, that's going to be your EOC activation support, your incident response support in weather. So primarily, NWS has been doing this for a while, but typically they do offer weather EOC activation support. This could be either in person or virtual. Right now with COVID, I believe a lot of their operations are still somewhat virtual for EOC. However, at wildfires, I know they are currently deploying IMETs, so that would be an in-person deployment where you would have that meteorologist on site, either in your command post or your EOC, giving you weather information, data, and briefings. For weather briefings, Those can either be oral over the phone or in person, or they can actually be graphic. Some offices actually are making live videos to do that. Some are actually recording videos, and then others are making graphics that are slides that explain the forecast. And then also, especially in the terms of special events, a lot of NWS offices can actually take any of your real-time data triggers. So maybe you have a criteria for a special event for a stage, or for bounce houses, or for evacuation for lightning. And you can give those triggers to your local office, and they will actually monitor storms for you and let you know when those triggers are starting to be approached. That is a really helpful thing because it allows emergency managers to focus on just making the decisions, and it lets the scientist who understands radar interpretation and storm dynamics to help assist with that. However, it's really important to note that NWS will never tell you when to make a decision, as in when to evacuate or to not evacuate or things like that. It's a very slippery slope. All they can do is just tell you what the storm is doing and if it's approaching your trigger. If you're interested in more information, definitely recommend reaching out to your local NWS office. Some offices have different policies on how much special event support they will do. So have a discussion, involve them in your event planning, and really build that bridge. We also have INWS, which are weather watch and warning alert text messages, which can be very helpful if you have to pull any triggers for a special event. And also NWS chat, which is typically where the meteorologist can inform you about storm development. They can go back and forth and give you support, and they can also inform you of those triggers that are going on at that time. Lastly is hazmat and fire. So this is actually a little bit of a unique one that I want to make sure everyone is aware of. And I think everybody is pretty familiar about fire support with IMETs and wildfire forecasting and things like that. However, they can actually do hazmat support in terms of plume modeling and also providing spot forecasts and weather conditions. Once again, this is extremely important because with a critical hazmat, there could be serious implications for exposure to that chemical and that plume. Might be planning evacuations, might be planning shelter in places. It's important to have those SMEs ready to support you with weather data rather than trying to use an app that might not be accurate or trying to Google and hope that you find the correct weather information that might cost lives. So let's go into some of the tools for weather data forecasts and observations. So I like to always start with dashboards. Being in an emergency operations center, typically we're always looking for that all-inclusive visual look that summarizes what's going on in terms of weather and is also nice to look at. So on the screen, you'll see on the left, I've got Now Coast up, and then on the right, I have NWS Enhanced Data Display. So you'll see both of them have an overall look and a summary to them. They can be overlaid with different products. You can toggle off and on, watches, warnings, forecasts, river forecasts, river heights, observations, all of those things. You can load up the map as much as you want, or you can make it as simplistic as you want. You can also put radar and satellite up, like on the Now Coast, as you can see. And so it's a very cool way to have an overall situational awareness. For Now Coast, you'll see that's a little more marine based. The example we have up there is when we had some coastal watches and warnings going on, as well as some coastal flooding. So you'll see that there are different things like tide predictions, river forecasts, weather forecast guidance, and things a little more related to coast. In EDD, you'll see that it's a little more inclusive or exclusive, whatever the one is. And you'll see that you can put radar on, satellite, the current watches and warnings, any tropical forecasts that are currently existing, as well as rivers, observations, and for the weather weenies out there like me, you can actually put the model spread of what the NWS models are saying and where the office is putting their guidance, which is very interesting to see how in some setups where they kind of try to split the hairs and really forecast between some models that might have a wide difference in whether or not it might rain or not. The last dashboard I want to kind of show is the graphical hazard weather outlook. And once again, a lot of these products, since I did it for the Maryland Symposium, are related to the NWS Baltimore, Washington office. So if you're not aware of this product, I always recommend to reach out to your local NWS office and ask them if they have something similar. You're welcome to screenshot the slide. I also posted a list of all of these toolkit links onto my LinkedIn, so you're welcome to pull it from there and just send it to them and ask. But going back to this, so this is a really great way to just see what kind of hazards are in play for the week. So you'll see that we have a risk level from none in green, yellow limited, orange elevated, red significant. So a simple risk level scale. And then on the right, we have our hazards. Severe thunderstorm, tornado, lightning, excessive rainfall or flooding, fog, ice accumulation. So you can see based on the chart from Thursday to Tuesday, I have a limited risk of lightning. So while this doesn't tell me when the lightning is going to occur, the timing of the lightning, the location, well, it does kind of tell you the location a little bit. It just tells you the general exposure of the hazard. So it might be very helpful, like if you're doing a weekly sit rep or a weekly executive briefing, to be able to inform and just let people know, hey, you know, we have a significant risk of lightning or fire weather on Sunday. And so we're going to be monitoring and preparing for any kind of actions we might need to take before that. So after you take a look at this scale, you would obviously look at a little more formal weather forecast from the National Weather Service to get the timing and the actual impact. Weather maps and observations. So some of us are very visual and some of us really like to have that classic weather front map that shows the weather systems. It shows the locations of the warm fronts, the cold fronts, the high and low pressure. It shows also based on the fronts where we're going to see precipitation, severe weather risk, flood risk, etc. And so if you're looking for something like that for a typical sit rep or whatever you might be doing, you can typically go to the Weather Prediction Center and find the national forecast charts that way. Or usually I believe there's a link or an icon on the local NWS page that will actually redirect you to these national forecast charts. Not only will they show you kind of in real time where the current setup is and the current fronts, they also typically include a couple of days out. So day 1 would be today, day 2 tomorrow, day 3 the day after tomorrow. So you can kind of see the speed of the systems and where the precipitation is moving. If that's not for you, which is not for a lot, that's okay. We actually have observation charts provided, usually on your local NWS page, that show you specific readings for things like temperature, dew point, heat index, sky cover, and precipitation potential. The cool thing about this is that it's actually telling you what the observations are currently, but it's also showing you hours out. So it's showing you a forecast of the observations on top of what's going on. This tool is really helpful because especially if you have a fire marshal's office or you have fire investigation officers who are looking for weather data for structure fires or for certain incidents, maybe traffic investigations. This is a great way to give them things like temperature, wind speed, etc., which has been very beneficial for some of my past partners that I've worked with. All right, so more weather maps and observations. So we do have storm reports on the Storm Prediction Center SPC website. These are actually storm reports coming in about tornadoes and tornado damage, wind damage and reported wind speed, and also hail damage and hail size. So it's very valuable to be able to check these out as they're loaded up. A lot of reports are typically delayed because by the time they're either called in or submitted or found by the local NWS office. It's usually after the crazy hectic storms. However, it is still good to just monitor during your activation or during your situational awareness of the storms, and then just to keep tabs on. You might actually find some damage reports in areas of your jurisdiction that you were not expecting, and you might be able to supplement that with any additional windshield surveys or any additional information to help you steer the operational decision for trying to design damage assessments and things like that. It's very interesting and neat because usually with storm reports, they'll give you a county location, the crossroads, or an address, as well as comments. The comments can be extremely specific regarding exactly what kind of structural damage they found, if there were fatalities, etc. And keep in mind too, a lot of these storm reports will actually come from dispatch, especially if the local NWS office is accustomed to calling dispatch for those reports. Or they will also come from social media and other means. And then lastly, in terms of observations, I just wanted to point out the Storm Prediction Center Mesoscale Analysis tool. This is a very high subject matter expert tool because it has different things like upper air, thermodynamics, wind shear, and composite indices and things like that. And if you're not a subject matter expert in weather forecasting or meteorology, it can be very confusing. So I don't recommend trying to go and take a look at any of that. But I do recommend checking out the observations because you can actually see the wind direction and a lot of the different areas. Moving into winter weather. So obviously being in Maryland, one of our big priorities in the winter is making sure that we understand winter weather forecasts, the probabilities, snowfall ranges and amounts, and then any kind of community impact that could occur. And lucky for us, our local NWS office has a snow tab where they have all sorts of different snow and winter products in one place. We have our expected snowfall map, so kind of that middle range estimate or forecast of how much snow we might be getting in an area. We also have the high end or the worst case scenario map with some of the models going above the average. And then we also have the low end or the lesser, I guess it's not the worst case, the best case scenario of having a snow bust and not having to do anything in terms of EOC operations. So it's very nice to just kind of have that worst case and the least case and then that middle average case, because you can kind of just design exactly what your jurisdiction might need based on that. We also have a 6-hour snowfall forecast, which is really important, especially if we have high snowfall rates. I think all of us in operations know that our partners and our friends at DPW typically require a certain amount of time to be able to get a certain amount of inches off the road and complete their tracks. And if they're exceeding that, they easily get behind and we can see significant issues similar to what we saw, I believe, in Virginia last year with some of the vehicle stalling. And then we also have, obviously, ice accumulation forecasts and different products with ice storms. On the right, you'll see that we have the Winter Storm Severity Index, which is a national level tool. It's very cool because it's an experimental product where NWS is trying to take a look at projected snowfall amounts and rates and trying to estimate whether or not a significant community impact will occur or a limited community impact will occur. So it's very neat to kind of keep tabs on that. You can see estimates from day 1, day 2, day 3, and then experimental 4 and 5. And it's really helpful to just be able to take a look at your forecast, take a look at what they're saying with the impacts, and then understand what's going on in your jurisdiction. Some emergency managers have said for them, minor and moderate impacts isn't a big deal. However, moderate impacts out here might be a big deal for a place like Alabama or Texas or a place in the South. So it's a great product to just use, especially if you're trying to communicate with the public in terms of impacts and risk. It's also a good product to reach out and give feedback on, especially if especially if it is not accurate to what is going on. Coastal flooding. So once again, coastal flooding might not be relevant to all jurisdictions or everybody watching this. For us, our county has a large amount of coastal interface along the Chesapeake Bay. And so we typically do see coastal flooding, we see high tide flooding and nuisance flooding. And so it's important for us to have water levels, inundation mapping, also impact resources. And we're very lucky because we have this NWS coastal flood forecast page straight from LWX, NWS Baltimore themselves. So we can take a look at all the different coastal gauges, see what category of flooding they have. We can also see where the watches and warnings are. And then we can also see water level quick looks and inundation and additional resources provided by other adjacent agencies who are working on flood modeling. Rainfall and flooding. So flooding is a huge hazard for us in the mid-Atlantic, but especially urban flash flooding, and especially with the challenges of climate change. So we're always looking for different resources to make sure that we understand river gauge height and what the river forecast is going to be. Also taking a look at precipitation and having some easy to read briefing graphics to provide our partners. And then lastly, taking a look at flash flood potential risk and that QPF amount, which is that total amount of precipitation or rainfall. So for us, we heavily utilize the NWS Local River and Mid-Atlantic River Forecast Center. They are our weather river flooding forecast experts, and they do a really great job of putting everything in one place. I can take a look at river observations, river forecasts, long-range river risk, precipitation, gauges, and then they do a great job of actually making graphics on past precipitation, future precipitation, and graphical briefings. Now, one of my favorite things that I wanted to talk about tonight is the Weather Prediction Center precipitation forecast and the Weather Prediction Center excessive rain forecast. So you can see the QPF forecast on the left is a fancy map, like I said, that shows you just the total rainfall amounts. So areas in the purple could be expected to see 2 to 2.5 inches on day 1, which would be today. Day 2 would be tomorrow, and you can see exactly how much you would get tomorrow. And then if you were to actually have a multi-day incident or a flood event, you can go to the totals where it says day 1 through 2, 1 through 3, 1 through 5, 1 through 7. And that makes it really easy to see what your total event will be over more than just one day. I tend to check the QPF forecasts and the WPC maps once a week, just so I can have a general assessment on if we're going to have a dry week, if we're going to have a wet week. Obviously, when we start having weeks that are 3+ inches, we start to lean forward a little more. If I start to see oranges, I'm very concerned. And then obviously anything above that would be a concern. Now, in terms of the excessive rainfall forecast, this is a really cool newer flash flood category outlook that WPC has been working very hard on in an attempt to try to predict when we have life-threatening or impactful flash flooding in the country. So you'll see that there are green marginal risk areas of flash flooding, yellow slight, moderate red, pink high. And so it's very similar to the SPC Storm Prediction Center severe thunderstorm categories, because they're trying to give you a general idea of what your risk is for day 1, day 2, day 3, and then experimental 4 and 5. I will say that WPC does a very good job being able to forecast very high impact events. So anytime that they usually forecast moderate risk of flash flooding or even a high risk of flash flooding, there is typically always flood fatalities associated with that. And if there's not flood fatalities associated with it, there is severe damage and some kind of flood operations going on. So it's a really great resource to lean forward once again and prepare yourself. When you start to see that red and that pink on that map, you can probably start to plan to pre-deploy resources, brief out, and lean forward for a potentially catastrophic flood event. Moving into severe weather with the Storm Prediction Center, like I mentioned before. So these are their severe weather outlooks and their categories of concern. And it's a very similar color scheme as the flood one that I showed you. So we have green and marginal, yellow and slight, orange and enhanced, red and moderate, and pink and high risk. So obviously, the higher the category, the bigger chance of the risk of severe. And then also keep in mind for enhanced, moderate, and high risk days, they typically mean that storms will be very damaging and potentially widespread. So anything in the orange, red, or pink color is extremely concerning and should be watched. The cool thing too is they do more than just have a general severe weather outlook for categories. They also will break down the hazards. So you can actually take a look on the right where we're looking at the hail outlook, but you can also look at the tornado outlook and the wind outlook. This is extremely helpful as well because an enhanced risk today might not be the same as an enhanced risk next week. Today, it might be damaging straight line winds. Next week, it might be large hail. Or today, it might be moderate risk of tornadoes. Next week, it might be all straight line winds, no tornadoes. So it's just another level of understanding for what kind of hazards you're going to see, because severe weather and convective weather and severe thunderstorms can produce different kinds of risks. Then moving into fire weather, so we've got NWS local fire weather forecast tools and also Storm Prediction Center fire weather outlook. So luckily our office actually has a fire weather icon and a page similar to what they have for winter and then also coastal. So I can find fire danger maps, dead fuel moistures, and they actually link to a lot of partners that do a lot of this forecasting specifically for fuels and vegetation, especially like in the Forest Service. And then too, you'll see with the SPC, they do the same outlooks or kind of similar concept for the fire weather. So you'll see there's elevated risk, critical risk, and it's very interesting because out west, usually when they have those critical risks or above like extreme, they will actually pre-deploy resources and strike teams and things like that to better be positioned to respond to a wildfire start. So tropical weather. I think everybody is pretty familiar with the National Hurricane Center and a lot of the cone diagrams we see. I believe that we all do a pretty good job of leaning on sharing the official NOAA forecast information. But just in case you're not familiar, I wanted to make sure to show the tropical development outlooks, some of the wind forecast timing and projected locations, and then also some of the storm surge flooding potentials. So on the left, you'll see the 2 to 5 day forecast or outlook of systems that could form. That's just a really great way to get an overview of what systems are currently already out there, as well as any areas of concern that could form. So you can be situationally aware and ready to start doing briefings or making moves. And then on the right, I absolutely love this newer product. It is actually a forecast of the reasonable arrival time for tropical storm force winds. So this is really, really essential if you're going to be doing logistics or anything that has wind operations that could be impacted. So for instance, I use the example of us with my time in Texas, sending our communications platform down to help with Hurricane Harvey in Houston response. So it was very cool to be able to use this tool to know what time and what day the tropical storm force winds would show up, so we could actually send the truck earlier and make sure it got there before the wind threshold for the high profile communications platform was met. So with that, we're going to move right into community programming. So like I mentioned, Skywarn is a pretty well-known program in emergency management. It is all about community reporting, and it's all about training our community to be able to take a look at storm and damage and make reports directly to the National Weather Service, who can then also partner with EM to make sure that they're getting those reports. As emergency managers, we can actually set up classes, either virtual or in person, and we can engage our community to take these classes and not only build a partnership between our community and emergency management, but also build a partnership between our community and the National Weather Service. CocoRoss, which is the rain gauge program I mentioned, very, very cool because it's all about community rainfall reporting, and you can actually see on the website where all the CocoRoss gauges are. So it's very neat to see the high density areas, especially in urban areas where the gauges are, and then very interesting to see some of the data holes like up here in northern Baltimore County, where maybe we should do a little bit of outreach and try to get some gauges up there. Obviously, these gauges help fill the gaps in official weather station data. We do not have a strong weather station coverage and amount in Maryland, and so this does help at least once a day report on what the rainfall totals were from storms previous. We also can engage the community in flood-prone areas, make them a little more proactive in being aware of not only the rain they're getting in their yard, but also the changes in climate and some of our risks of flooding. Storm Ready, like I mentioned, it's a really fantastic program that actually will ensure weather readiness in local jurisdictions. So for your city, for your county, for your university, it's a checklist to make sure that you are prepared for weather, that you understand how to get watches and warnings, that your EOC is to a certain level to get watches and warnings, as well as your warning point or your dispatch center. It also requires a certain amount of training. And then lastly, it usually involves doing an NWS tour and an overview of some of the local services and specialties that they might provide to you as an emergency manager in their CWA. Weather Ready Nation Ambassadors, once again, is a great program where you can assist a pledge to partner with the Weather Ready Nation mission with organizations. So while a lot of governments and public safety have done this, there have been a ton in the private sector, schools, hospitals, all sorts of different groups who have joined the Weather Ready Nation Ambassador program. The goal of this is to also promote ambassadors to conduct public education and outreach projects in their company to prepare their employees and their families, and then also to get them to participate in monthly updates via the flyer that they send out and any webinars or seminars. So the National Weather Service Safety Season Campaign is a really great resource for public safety agencies who might need free graphics on weather safety. They might need video resources for different kinds of weather hazards. And they also have a hurricane awareness campaign that they do for Hurricane Awareness Week. So this is a really great place to go, and especially when you're ramping up for weather, share official graphics, push people back to the official source of the National Weather Service for official forecasts, and once again, promote that weather safety partnership that we have. And now we're going to move into instant decision support. So obviously, all National Weather Service offices offer their instant support a little differently, but for the most part, everybody has NWS chat. That's that 24/7 chat room where emergency managers have access, media meteorologists have access, public safety can have access, and the National Weather Service have access. So it's a fairly limited tool where people will be able to ask questions, coordinate, share damage, etc., to kind of just have a better situational awareness among all of those different communication partners. They also, as a 24/7 office, can be contacted for support 24/7, So usually they'll have a number for partners to call if they need to get a weather forecast update or they need to relay any information. Our office automatically does biweekly emergency management briefings on the forecast on Monday mornings and Thursday mornings. Some other offices only do briefings when threats arise. So it's important to check out your office cadence and what your office does. Our office also has an emergency management page with different resources similar to what I shared tonight. Once again, check with your office, see what they have specifically for emergency management. And then lastly, check with your office to see what their procedure is for EOC staffing. They might only want to offer briefings via phone. They might do a virtual staffing. It's really important to check with the jurisdiction and also check with the local office to see what their stance is. And as I start to wrap up this presentation, I just want to have a simple reminder of the difference of public meteorology and private meteorology. And so obviously with NOAA and the National Weather Service, this is a 100% 24/7 operations public service. It is free for you to use. They're public servants, just like a lot of us who work in government emergency management. And so you're already paying for their services with taxes, so you don't have to pay again. There are also a lot of really great reputable companies in the private sector who do different products, different support, create forecasts, do briefings, maybe even issue specialized weather hazard specifically for hospital evacuations and things like that. And examples would be things like AccuWeather and Earth Networks. The only thing with private is just to make sure that you verify and that they are reputable companies. So if they are outside of AccuWeather or Earth Networks, you just want to make sure to do your research and ask questions and make sure that they are legitimate. There have been some private companies that try to either sell the science that doesn't exist, so tell you that they can forecast a tornado on a block level, which they can't, or tell you that they can do something that is not possible with science, which they can't. And it could really cost the jurisdiction thousands without doing that research. So you just want to make sure that you understand what you're buying, that you're asking questions, and you're getting subject matter expertise from somebody. And then lastly, keep in mind that the National Weather Service is the only authority to issue storm watches and warnings. And so if there's anybody else who's kind of doing that on their own haphazardly, you'll probably know that that's probably not a legitimate thing. And then with that, my contact information, if you have any questions about any of the things I talked about tonight, if you want to reach out about any weather resources, or of course, if you have any additional tools I didn't mention, you can find me on Twitter at MissAshes92, LinkedIn at Ashley Morris, Gmail at aemorrisem@gmail.com. And then of course, my office number is listed. So I want to thank you so much for taking a look at my presentation tonight. And I really appreciate it. Have a good one.